So for a long time, I mostly lived in the plugin world, and this year is the year that I'm getting hardware and getting more into hardware. The most recent additions, and they all kind of arrived at the same time weirdly, are the Bettermaker Mastering Limiter, the Roland TR-8S on this side over here, and the Moog Subsequent 37 synthesizer sitting right here. I also have the Isla Instruments S2400 drum sampler coming, I think, in about a month. I'll post a picture somewhere on the screen so you can see what it looks like, but I'm super excited about that one as well. And with that addition, I'm actually gonna have 3 ways of sampling things now. One through the OP1, the second through the Roland TR-8S, and the third through the Isla. It's gonna be more than enough options of chopping up samples. And I know there's a never-ending debate about hardware versus software. Is hardware worth it? A lot of people will say that plugins can do everything that hardware can do. A lot of people will say that you can't live without hardware. I'm not gonna argue that debate today. I'm just speaking about hardware from a personal perspective. It has more to do with my workflow and personal preference. I'm not gonna talk about like, oh, you can't make the same bass in Serum, you can only make it on a Moog. So I'm just gonna leave it at that for the purposes of this video. And personally for me, I like hardware. I like to be able to physically feel the knobs of a synthesizer when I'm doing some sound design, for example. Like, yes, you can sit there and you can map things on a MIDI controller, but it's not the same. You're not able to click things in the same way and rotate knobs in the same way. Just not the same as being hands-on with a synthesizer and just playing around with things until something magical happens. So for me, that's kind of why I like hardware. I like to physically feel the instruments as I'm working with them and not sit in front of my computer and a mouse and keyboard all day. It just makes the process more fun. And out of curiosity, leave a comment below if you like to work in software, if you like to work in mostly hardware, or if you like a mix of both. Kind of curious what all of you guys prefer. And you know, the big question is, why did I buy the gear that I bought? Why do I have it? And the answer is, I'm always just looking to improve my workflow, to make music more fun, and just overall improve the sound and the quality of my work. I feel like if you improve your workflow and you make it more fun, then the end product always ends up being better. In this little home studio that I have, I do everything from recording, songwriting, production, mixing, mastering. So for me, workflow is extremely important, especially in such a small space, right? Like, I'm really trying to optimize my workflow without cluttering the space, but also adding enough to make things fun and, most importantly, fast. When you have an idea during the songwriting, production, mixing, mastering process, like, you really have to act on it quickly, otherwise that idea is gone. So for me, I'm specifically picking gear that I think is gonna speed up my workflow and get ideas out from my head into Logic at the end of the day. So first, let's start with the Roland TR-8S. For those of you who don't know, it's a drum sampler made by Roland. It has a pattern sequencer with different sounds built into it, all made by Roland. They have the classic TR-808, 909 sounds. You can load in your own drum samples through the SD card. And for me, the reason why I got this is during the songwriting process, it takes sometimes a bit of time to figure out the right drum patterns and drum sounds to match either a musical idea that I have, or even just to get going and try to see what can happen. So for me, having this pattern layout right here and being able to come up with lots of different drum ideas on the fly pretty quickly is a win for me. And yeah, I can make different templates in Logic and, you know, add different drum kits, but for me, like, when I'm songwriting, I don't want to be glued to my computer. You know, I want to come to the drum station here, come up with a drum pattern, come to my piano over here, come up with, you know, a riff or a melody or some chord structure, come to the bass synthesizer, come up with a bass pattern, and kind of get going on a song idea rather than relying on my computer. Maybe it'll crash, maybe it'll freeze, maybe some drum samples won't load properly. Like, it's just a much faster process to have this hardware just easily accessible when you're writing songs. So for example, let's pretend I want to make a house beat. And that's it. Now we're ready with house beat. I can write a bass line to this and see where it goes. Which brings me to my second recent purchase, which is the Moog, I don't know, however you pronounce it, Subsequent 37. It is a bass synthesizer and it's just an absolute beast. And again, like, I'm not bringing the hardware versus software debate into this, but yeah, you can recreate a lot of sounds in the software realm, but it just takes a while. Like, if you try to make a good bass sound in software that can tackle all different genres, it's just difficult. You can get there, it's just gonna take you a long time. And again, when I'm thinking about it from a songwriting perspective or from a production perspective, I wanna get to the sound quickly so I can move on to the next thing and not let the idea in my head die. And with the Moog, as soon as you step up to it and turn a few knobs, you can get a sound that's pretty close to the final product very quickly. And in my opinion, all the different knobs that it has, all the different ways of manipulating the sound and being able to sound design with your hands is just a lot more fun, in my opinion. You can do some of this in the software realm, but is it fun? It's so-so. I think when you do the same process on a synth, it just makes the music creation process a lot more interesting. And you know, some of you will say, look, you can do this on a MIDI controller, or you can buy different MIDI controllers, and you can map all of the different knobs from a software synthesizer to the knobs of a MIDI controller. But again, it's just not the same. It's not linear on a MIDI controller. You don't have different types of knobs that can click, for example, like they do on the Moog. You don't have a filter knob that with a lot of resistance that's just massive like you do on the Moog. And all of the different knobs and the way that they've been designed and the way that the resistance or the clicks or whatever it is has been designed on the synth has been tailored to this synth specifically. But when you map things to MIDI controller, like, it's as if you're trying to map 50 different synths to the same 8 knobs. It just doesn't work from the perspective of being as immersed in that synth as you would be with the hardware that's created for a synth specifically. Okay, so I'm gonna create just something basic on the Moog here just to show you how easy it is and how insane this thing sounds like. So we can just start with oscillator number 1 right here. Sounds pretty cool. But as soon as you add oscillator number 2, like, that already sounds wild to me. And then you add the sub oscillator, spice things up, times 100. Like, to me, that's just insane, right? Like, trying to get that out of a plugin, you can get it, like, you can really get close, but it takes such a long time, right? Like, that took me no longer than a few twists of the knob, like a few button clicks, and you're good to go with a beautiful sound, like just such a rich, raw bass sound. Like, we can even add a glide, right? Like, to make it more interesting. So for example, that just sounds wild. And what I love about having a synth right in front of me is just being able to see everything, right? Like, being able to see that these are the modulation sections, the arpeggiator section, the mixer, the filter, right? Like, even just being able to play around with a filter like this. Yeah, you can map it to a MIDI controller, but does a MIDI controller have a filter knob like this? No. Even if I wanted a quick arpeggiator going, right? Like, you just turn on the arpeggiator section, press on, and like, it's just fun. You know, yeah, like in plugins, You can probably get a similar sound, but it's boring as hell. On a Moog is just fun, and even just playing around with it for 2 seconds right now made me excited. So yeah, this is why I got this thing. This is why I'm getting into hardware. I just think it's sick. I think it's fun. That's my personal opinion, but yeah. And by the way, the sound that you're hearing from this, I didn't compress it, I didn't edit it, like that is the raw sound you're hearing out of the Moog. So just keep that in mind. And the last thing that I got is actually not a synth or a sampler, but it's mostly something that I use sometimes in the mixing process, but mostly in the mastering process. And that's the Bettermaker Analog Mastering Limiter. It's a full analog limiter that's digitally controlled. So what's cool about this thing is if I need to recall a session at any given point, I just load up a plugin in Logic made by Bettermaker, and it controls the entire unit. So digitally controlled, but all of the sound is 100% analog. And words can't really describe how crazy this thing is. Like, you can really push it really hard and get a musical result compared to like a FabFilter L2, which is still a great limiter, but if you push it really hard, it starts to distort, whereas the Bettermaker, if you push it hard, it does not distort. And I'll make a video about this thing in the future, but what's cool about it is it has a VCA limiter, it has a clipping section where you can actually decide how much of the signal you want to pass through to a analog clipper, and how much of the signal do you want to pass through to the VCA limiter. And the reason why it's helpful is because a lot of times you have transients that just get through an analog limiter. It's just inevitable. And you can specify to pretty much figure out what balance of clipping and what balance of VCA limiting makes sense for a particular song, and really fine tune that balance so that you're not getting a distorted signal, but you're getting an even, clean signal when you're boosting the volume during a mastering session. And this thing, you don't really have to use it in mastering either. I can use it in production, I can use it in mixing, because it also has the ability to add even or odd harmonics. And I find a lot of times if I take a bus of like a drum or a vocal bus or a synth bus, run it through the limiter, don't use it for the limiting function, but actually use it for the odd and even harmonics and bring it back, you can add a bit more depth, a bit more flavor to your sound, and really bring the mix together without having to introduce new sounds to your production, for example, and without having to muddy the mix. So it's kind of a cool feature as well. And again, the reason why I have it is when I'm mastering, it gets me to that final result quicker. And if it saves me time, it's a win for me. So over the next couple of weeks, I'm gonna be making videos about each of these hardware pieces individually. I'll also make a video probably about the Isla Instruments S2400, depending when that comes in. But leave a comment below to let me know which hardware piece you're most excited about. And yeah, I'm excited to try them out. I'm excited to use them and let you guys know what I think about them. So far though, they're pretty sick.